Hey guys, Greg Knuckles here with stringtheory.com, and today we're talking about squatting, specifically why you can squat more low bar than high bar. So the first thing we need to talk about, obviously, is how bar position changes the mechanics of the lift, and quite frankly, at least for light loads, it doesn't change it all that much. Basically, all you're doing is dropping the bar 2 to 3 inches further down your back onto your rear deltoids instead of on your traps. And frankly, this just doesn't make that big of a difference. Where the bar is always going to be situated right around over midfoot. And so you see here that when you're dealing with similar degrees of knee flexion and hip flexion, if you're changing bar position 2 to 3 inches, here the torso segments are 10% different in length. So the average torso is 30 inches long, just using average population data. So a 10% shift is realistic. And if you assume same degrees of dorsiflexion, knee flexion, then the only thing that changes is hip flexion, and it's actually quite a small change, only 2 to 3 degrees. Obviously, this doesn't tend to square with what we see in the gym and in the real world. So the next question becomes, why do low bar squats tend to look more hip dominant than high bar squats? Why don't they look alike? Why do your knees tend to go slightly farther forward for high bar squats and your hips tend to go slightly farther back for low bar squat? The primary reason for the difference you observe primarily has to do with the fact that the bottom of the squat is the most challenging part of the movement for the quads. So essentially, with a max load, the knee extension torque that you have to produce is going to be at its maximal. And torque has two components. There's moment arm length and there's resistance. So let's assume you can squat about 10% more low bar than high bar. So that's 10% more resistance. So you need about a 10% shorter moment arm. So the way that manifests itself is the knees shift backwards slightly, making up that 10% difference. But that also causes the hips to shift back slightly, which is what you tend to see with low bar squats. So this raises an interesting quandary. Around parallel and through the sticking point for low bar and high bar squats, you're dealing with similar knee extension torque, which that arises because it's the most you can possibly handle. However, since those hips shift backwards slightly with low bar squats, you're dealing with quite a bit more required hip extension torque because one, the moment arm's longer because the knees and hips both shift back a little bit, and the load's heavier. So both of those variables that go into the torque calculation, both of those are increased for low bar squatting. So same knee extension torque, so that should be just as hard. More hip extension torque, so that should be even harder. However, you can lift more weight. So the question becomes, what is the limiting factor? So really you only have two potential options. The first is that it's your calves, the ability to produce plantar flexion, which I hope we can all agree right off the bat that your calves aren't the limiting factor in your squat. So the only other option you have is your back strength, your spinal erectors, your ability to keep your spine extended to transfer that force from your legs and your hips into the bar. Now, this may not sit well with some people because a lot of people have the idea that low bar squats are harder for your back because they see that you're leaning over farther. And typically, when you're leaning over farther, that means that something's going to be harder for your back. However, that's only true when you're comparing like exercises. So if you're comparing, say, a low bar squat with a certain degree of forward lean and a low bar squat with a greater degree of forward lean, then yes, the low bar squat with the greater degree of forward lean is going to present a greater challenge to your back. However, when you're comparing different exercises, then you have moment arms of different lengths that you're dealing with. And it's not only the degree of forward lean, it's also the degree that simply the shift in barbell position changes those moment arms and the amount of torque that those spinal erectors have to produce to keep the spine extended. So, to explain this a bit by way of analogy, the front squat. Most people would agree that the front squat tends to present a greater challenge to your back extensors, your spinal erectors, than the low bar squat does. If you don't, then it's probably just because you haven't front squatted very much. A lot of times, your legs and hips are capable of lifting a much heavier load than your back is. So now to see how this principle applies directly to high bar and low bar squatting. The black curvy line running through the picture represents the spine with a natural lumbar and thoracic curvature. The two red circles at the top right represent high bar and low bar position. The one on the right is high bar, one on the left is low bar. And the arrows represent the spinal extension moment arms for the thoracic extensors and the lumbar extensors. The orange ones for high bar and the green ones for low bar. So as you can see, because the low bar position has the bar sitting slightly higher and when in hip flexion farther forward, for both the thoracic and lumbar spines, the absolute difference in moment arm is greater for high bar than low bar. You'll also notice that the relative difference is greater for the thoracic spine than it is for the lumbar spine. So if we assume a 10% difference in bar load, there might be about a 10% difference in moment arm when we're comparing the lumbar spine. However, it's probably closer to a 25 to 30% difference when we're comparing the thoracic spine, which is similar in principle to front squatting. Even though the load is slightly less, because the relative length of that moment arm is quite a bit longer, that still means, even with a lower weight, you're presenting a larger relative challenge to those thoracic erectors to keep the spine extended so you can transfer that force from your legs and hips into the bar. So that's the primary reason. Once you look at everything, it's not your quads, it's certainly not your hip extensors because they're having to work harder for low bar, and I think we can safely assume it's not your calves. So it has to be, well, and it's probably not those lumbar extensors either, because when you look at the total torque they have to produce, even though the moment arm is longer for high bar, that's probably canceled out by the slightly less amount of weight. So torque is probably similar. However, there's a pretty sizable difference in the thoracic spine, so there's probably where our weakness is coming from. So back strength is the main factor, specifically thoracic erector strength. However, there's something else that plays into this as well, albeit to a slightly lesser degree, and that is where the bottom position is. So with low bar squat, since you're in a few greater degrees of hip flexion with any absolute amount of dorsiflexion and knee flexion, what that's going to mean is you simply hit the bottom position of a squat. You reach that full hip flexion position a little bit sooner, and that means essentially that when you're getting that rebound, that stretch reflex, that it is going to help carry you through a more relevant portion of the lift. What you see here is, based on research, the average sticking point of the squat, slightly above parallel, femur at about a 30-degree angle to the floor. So when you're doing slightly deeper high bar squats, you catch that stretch reflex, you're quite a bit below parallel, it helps you get that bounce, but then it's largely dissipated by the time you're even nearing that sticking point, the weakest portion of the lift. However, for low bar squats, since you're in a few greater degrees of hip flexion, you hit that bottom position a little bit higher, that stretch reflex helps carry you through a somewhat more relevant portion of the lift, so you may still have some speed and power from that stretch reflex still hanging around as you start approaching that sticking point, meaning that you may have a little bit more speed going into the sticking point to help you carry through it, instead of having to get through it mainly on just pure horsepower the same way you would have to for a high bar squat. That is the major reason why a lot of weightlifters who have turned powerlifter do tend to squat a little bit more low bar than high bar. However, the spread isn't nearly as large as it is for powerlifters. For powerlifters, about a 10% spread is pretty common. However, for weightlifters, that's quite a bit smaller. And the main reason for that is, remember, the primary limiting factor is thoracic erector strength. Weightlifting training, you're doing a ton of pulls, you're doing a ton of front squats, a lot of things that really put a premium on upper back strength. So they're less likely to be limited by that than a powerlifter is. However, where that bottom position is, having a slightly higher natural bottom position, because most people, once they've been under the bar for a while, realize that if you can sink the squat a couple inches deeper and catch that stretch reflex, you tend to be stronger than cutting it a couple inches higher. Not necessarily a couple inches above parallel, but let's say you can squat 3 inches below parallel, and that's your bottom position where you catch that stretch reflex. You'll tend to be a little bit stronger squatting all the way down there than you would if you cut it, say, 1 inch below parallel. So that's still in play. So a lot of weightlifters, when they make the switch over to powerlifting, Max Aida and Chinwei Ling are two great examples of this. They've moved over to low bar squatting for powerlifting because it is still somewhat advantageous. However, the spread between their high bar and low bar squats isn't nearly as great as it would be for someone who's only been a powerlifter, because since they have that weightlifting background, they're not as limited by that thoracic extensor strength. So in wrapping up, those are the two main reasons why you can squat more low bar than high bar, in spite of the fact that low bar has the same knee extension demands and even greater hip extension demands. The first thing is you're less likely to be limited by spinal erector strength, specifically thoracic erectors. And the second thing is that stretch reflex tends to help you out through a more relevant portion of the lift, closer to parallel and through the sticking point. Now, just in conclusion, one of the pieces of pushback that I'm expecting to get is someone to post a picture similar to this one, of someone doing a low bar squat with a super upright bottom position and say, oh, no one who low bar squats looks like that, no one's that upright. You're trying to say that these are two quite similar movements with just a couple small differences between them, but see, look at this picture of someone with beautiful bottom position of a high bar squat. Low bar squat will never look like that. This is complete nonsense. However, remember, the most relevant portion of the lift when we're talking about mechanics and what's likely to be the limiting factor is where you miss the lift, which tends to be somewhere around parallel to just above parallel through that sticking point. And when you compare, even someone who has a really upright, super deep bottom position for a high bar squat like this, when they start coming up out of the hole, their hips tend to kick back and they wind up in a position that looks much more similar to the one we're talking about. And if you'll notice, there's quite a bit of forward lean still. It looks, well, like a low bar squat, except the bar a couple inches up higher. And conversely, a low bar squat through the sticking point, unless it's someone who has just a super hip dominant squat, tends to look like a high bar squat with the bar 2 or 3 inches lower. And that's what you would expect, because bar position doesn't really change that much, even though people like to make a big deal about it. Alright guys, so that's all I've got for this video. I'm sure you are starting to get tired of hearing me rambling, but if this is a subject that interests you, check out the description. There will be 4 or 5 articles down there that I've written about this topic that go into quite a bit more depth if you'd like to deepen your understanding of this specific topic, but also just squatting mechanics in general. As always, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe, and thanks a lot for watching.